make an accusation, and then somebody else will state that they're going to sue for defamation. And in fact, more and more litigation has been taking place arising out of defamation. Now, what is defamation? Defamation involves a false statement of fact that's communicated to a third party, which causes harm and is made with some level of fault. Now, that level of fault, that threshold, is actually different for a private actor or a public actor. To establish defamation, a plaintiff generally must prove the following elements in the United States, and I will say that this will vary a little bit jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but we're just going to keep this general. So, defamation, number one, if you're filing a suit trying to show that you've been defamed, initially you have to show that there was a false defamatory statement of fact that was made. The defendant must have made a statement of fact that's not an opinion, and either made it in writing, which would be considered libel, or made it verbally, which would be slander. That statement must be considered defamatory, meaning it would harm the plaintiff's reputation or lower them in the estimation of the community. Next, there needs to be a publication of that statement to a third party. So in other words, the statement must have been communicated to someone other than the plaintiff. If the defendant and the plaintiff are in a room together and the defendant makes a statement of fact about the plaintiff but doesn't ever say this outside of that room where they're alone and nobody's listening, it's not considered defamation because there's no publication. But even a single third-party publication is sufficient. So in other words, 3 individuals on a text thread and one of them makes a statement of fact, which is considered to be defamatory about another person on that text, and there's a third person that's also on the text, that would be enough to establish that element of publication. And then thereafter, there must be fault. Fault changes and varies. The damages that one has to show is definitive harm to reputation. So the plaintiff needs to show that they suffered some level of harm. That can be reputational, it can be emotional, or it can be economic. Some statements are considered defamation per se, where damages are actually presumed, meaning that you don't even have to show the harm. The statements were so egregious and so violative that the court's not even going to ask the plaintiff to show that it harmed their reputation. It'll be presumed, and therefore you don't even need to actually show by a preponderance of the evidence, 51%, that harm did take place. And we refer to this as defamation per se, where there's statutory liability so long as you can show the first couple of elements that we mentioned, the harm is going to be rendered abundantly clear. If you accuse somebody but it never actually happened, and you never bothered to investigate the veracity of your statement or even knew it was false, well, guess what? You're likely to be held liable for defamation. And since it's an allegation of a crime, it would be defamation per se. So you wouldn't even need to prove your harm. Number one, you're saying that the statement I made is defamatory, but my one defense could be truth. This is actually the truth. So if the statement turns out to be true, then it's not defamation. If you make this claim or statement about a private actor, then you can potentially avoid defamation, a claim or a judgment against you for defamation, if you can show you are negligent. And the way to show that would be to show that you made investigative efforts before publishing a comment, and therefore had a reasonable belief generally that indeed this statement was true or likely to be true. However, if you didn't make any efforts and you just were told by someone XYZ or so-and-so embezzled money, and you publish that, then you're likely to be considered to have committed defamation, and in fact you were likely negligent because you failed to take the time to conduct investigations. Now, it gets even more interesting with respect to public-facing actors, when there is a claim by a public actor or an institution alleging defamation. And I'm going to walk you through a case right now that's considered seminal in this area. It is called the New York Times versus Sullivan. It's a 1964 case. It involves the New York Times suing L.B. Sullivan, who was the Montgomery, Alabama City Police Safety Commissioner. What had happened was the Times had published a full-page advertisement titled "Heed Their Rising Voices" by civil rights leaders. This criticized the treatment of protesters by Southern authorities. The ad contained some factual inaccuracies. Sullivan, although he wasn't named, sued for libel, claiming he was defamed by implication. The issue then, when the New York Times sued before the Supreme Court, was whether a public official can recover damages for defamation concerning official conduct, showing that the statement was made with actual malice. The court ruled in favor of the New York Times, and the court established this actual malice standard, which required public officials to prove that defamatory statements were made with knowledge of their falsity or with reckless disregard for their truth. This ruling provided broad First Amendment protections for the press, especially regarding political reporting and criticism of government officials. Let's just break that down a little more and discuss what that really means. So let's say that you have a blogger, And this blogger is on Facebook scrolling or on Instagram, and there's a post by a disgruntled former employee of a restaurant. And the former employee says that John, the business owner, embezzled funds from the restaurant, right? Now, this individual, the blogger, takes that statement and now publishes it on his blog. And he says that John has embezzled funds from the restaurant and therefore, he's a terrible person, et cetera, et cetera. So, in this particular situation, what has essentially happened is John, and let's say, of course, that this statement turns out to not be true. Now, John would say, well, I just relied upon this Facebook post. So even though I now published, I had a material statement or a statement of fact, statement being that John has embezzled funds. It was published to third parties through my blog because I now published it to the public. So we've got publication down. The question, of course, it would be reputationally damaging and probably considered defamation per se because it's an allegation of committing a crime. But the question now becomes, well, okay, did you act reasonably under the circumstances? Now, John's a private actor. He's a restaurant owner, so nobody really knows him aside from maybe some people who go to the restaurant. So the question really is did John act negligently? And most likely the answer would be yes. Why? John did not take the time to undergo reasonable investigative efforts for publishing. So what could he have done? He could have reached out to the person that published this on Facebook to ask them what the basis was for their statement. He could have reached out to other employees of the company and had the same conversation. Have you heard anything about this? Do you think this might be true? He could have reached out to John directly for comment before publishing. Even though this individual blogger may not be a newspaper, they're still going to be held to the same standard with respect to whether or not they can be considered to be responsible or liable for defamation. In that instance, the blogger probably is. But now let's change the facts just a little bit. Let's say that this blogger, instead of saying that John embezzled funds from the restaurant, he says that there are allegations made that John embezzled funds from the restaurant. Now, allegations made and simply stating that John embezzled funds is a little bit different, right? But now let's take this, though, even further. John saw the post on Facebook and Instagram, and it was from this disgruntled employee who had this comment that said that John, the restaurant owner, is really bad person because he embezzled funds from the company. This time, the blogger not only contacts the poster, but reaches out to other former employees and employees of the company. This blogger then does call John before publication to let him know, I'm going to be publishing this on my blog post. Do you have any comments?